We are live.
Cool. Hi, everyone. This is Steve Curiel. Welcome. Just going to wait a few minutes before we get started.
In the meantime, Steve, let me do some housekeeping chores, okay?
Cool.
Good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Fiscal Management in Today's Adult Ed. My name is Adriana Sanchez-Aldana. I'm the Executive Director of the California Council for Adult Education. And today's webinar is a joint effort with the California Adult Education Administrators Association. Before we get started, I have a couple of logistical items to share with you before Steve gets started. If you're viewing this on your computer, there's a chat area at the bottom of your screen where you will be able to type in questions that you may have during the presentation. Victoria Bate of Mount Diablo and I will be monitoring the chat box, and we'll bring those questions to Steve either at the end of his presentation or at the end of the webinar. Many of you have asked if the webinar is being recorded, and the answer is yes. And a link will be posted on the CCAE website. I'd like to thank our annual partners, First Financial Credit Union, as well as Burlington English and GED Testing Service, for their continued support of our organization and our legislative efforts. Today's presenter is Steve Curiel, CAEAA State Ledge Chair and Principal of Huntington Beach Adult School, as well as CCAE Past President. And I'd like to thank David Palmer, CCAE Office Manager, as well, for technical assistance. And I will turn over the webinar. I think our numbers are up now, Steve. I'll turn the webinar over to Steve Curiel.
Okay, thank you, Adriana. Appreciate that. So welcome, everyone. Hopefully, you have all heard by now that we have a signed budget, state budget. So that's a great thing, and it seems a long time coming. It seems like we waited for a long time for that. So the details of which, in regards to adult ed, were communicated by Dom Kepke in a recent email that went out to the field. Also, the information is available on our CCAE state website. So I think most of you have not, to some extent, have been hearing some of the challenges that we're facing as a state. And recognizing this, some of us that have been in adult ed for a while and remember the past recession have thought it prudent to try to get some information out and help those that are new to the field. And so some of you might have participated in a webinar a few weeks ago where we talked about how we handled the recession cuts of 2008, 9, 9, 10, and on. And so this is intended to be more of a basic webinar and assisting people in understanding how adult ed budget works, or budget in general. And it's adapted from a presentation I do to the CALPRO Leadership Institute, which is typically about 4 hours. And today it's not going to be 4 hours. I'm going to do my best to get the basics pulled out of that and deliver that to you today in an hour, 45 minutes, hopefully, and leave time for questions. But I don't know if anyone knows me, has been hanging around with me at all. You might have known that I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and so today it feels like we're going to go light speed. It can feel like that. I hope it's not, but I do want to give you some basic understanding of an adult ed budget, and then add some context to it, or put it in the context of our current budget and what's coming for this year. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Okay, come on now. There we go. So what's the current environment that we're in right now? Just as like I said, state budget adopted, signed by the governor. So for this coming year, for starting tomorrow, 2021, we're looking at flat funding based on our allocation that we received for 1920. So whatever funds you receive this year, you can expect to get that allocation for next year. So pretty simple to start with that. So no big changes there. But the other reality is that we've got increased costs that we'll be looking at. Some of you might have salaries that have been negotiated that are now kicking into effect for July 1st. Distance learning implementation, there's some costs associated with that. If you're buying more Chromebooks or curriculum, training, professional development for staff, those are all added costs you'll be having to deal with. And then sanitizing your campus. any guidelines right now are pretty heavy on making sure rooms are sanitized, that you have hand sanitizer available for students, taking temperature of students and staff. So all these things add up to a pretty heavy burden that we're going to have to figure out how to cover these costs with a flat budget. And so that's part of the reality. And then there's still this uncertainty around tax revenues. As you recall, or might have recalled that the federal government pushed the tax return deadline from April 15th to July 15th. And so that means we do not have a really solid estimate or an idea of what those revenues are going to be like. The governor and legislature based their budget that they just passed on what they thought would be coming in terms of these revenues, but really we won't know, or we won't start finding out until July 15th and then the weeks and months after that as we track all these revenues. So we've all got our fingers crossed that these revenues are hitting the projections, and then hopefully then some, because there's still some other issues that have to be addressed in our budget that they didn't get around to doing so. So what does all that mean? So that just basically we're looking at increased financial pressure of both our districts and our schools. And so even though we have our own funding sources for the most part, a separate fund that we are mandated to use, and it's only allowed to be used for adult ed, districts are going to be facing their own financial pressures. And they are going to be looking for ways to make sure services are protected for kids. And in the past, back in the days of flexibility, that included tapping into the adult ed funds and using those funds. Currently, that's not an option for districts, but nonetheless, they will be looking for any ways they can to shore up their budgets and make sure services continue and they can meet all their obligations, financial obligations. And so that could in some way impact adult ed, maybe through restrictions on professional development, purchasing, hiring. Those are all things that a district could implement and that could have sweeping effects and include the adult ed program in those decisions. And so increased scrutiny over your spending. That's another expectation that most of us are probably experiencing already, but that can go on for this next year. Even though districts are not seeing a cut, they're getting the same funding that they received last year. Those added costs are pretty significant, and districts again will be looking at ways to make sure they're providing safe environments for everyone, hopefully. And but this whole presentation is intended to help you guys understand that there are pressures on districts and to understand your budget so that you know how to guide them in decisions that they might want to implement. So we'll go on to the next one. So what's your role? One of the things that I recognize and that not everyone is in the same boat as far as what say you have, what control you have over your budget. So whether it's from the very beginning, if you're able to involved in those conversations that set the priorities for your school, maybe handed down by the consortium that you're in, or if you're involved in the development of the budget, or just maybe you're a department administrator and you oversee expenditures, but you don't really have a say in the budget, how much in funds your department receives, or you're monitoring the whole entire budget or making adjustments as necessary at the highest level. These are all different aspects of budget management, and in some ways, or in some districts, the district office handles pretty much all of it for an adult school, and the administrator in charge of the program might only have say in the ordering supplies and materials. They might not even have say in hiring. That's a decision left at the district office. And so we're all have varying controls over the budgets. And so I want to recognize that and understand, appreciate not everyone's in the same boat. For me, in my district, I pretty much oversee the entire budget, and then get guidance from our district office and if they see any concerns. But if things need to be changed and prioritized, that falls on me and my team to make sure our budget is in line with our allocations, and then also we're adhering to any guidelines or policies, fiscal policies or district sets. But most important, if you're not involved in the budget, this is a common picture, a common idea that I'm stealing from Don Kepke, our advocate. She often says that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And so during this time, and again, with fiscal pressures on our district offices, they're going to be looking at every source of revenue, including adult ed funds, to see how they can get through this year and the next couple of years. So are you at the table in that? Are you having a say in your budget development? Are you able to see your budget and ask questions and make changes as necessary? That's the best place to be. And if you're not there, you want to advocate for that, to have some say in it and at least be able to see your budget. And so definitely do not want to assume that the district's got it handled, because you're not being at the table. That means that they're lacking in a voice, an expert, if you will, in adult ed matters to make good decisions. So getting into the basics, budgeting 101. So first thing you want to do is identify and total your revenues. So how much money are you bringing in? You've got your CAPE dollars. You could have WIOA, CalWorks. I'll go over some of the other fund sources, but you want to recognize all the different fund revenues. You want your district to share that with you. If you don't have that access, it's a simple email that a simple email request that they shouldn't have any problems in identifying and reporting to you what revenues you're receiving. And then you also have your expenses. You want to project those. What are your salaries projected to be? Utilities, if you have a facility that you're responsible for. And then obviously your supplies and books and materials, computers, things of that nature. So you want to make sure you know what your revenues are and then what your expenditures, and those two basic ideas. Subtract the expenditures from the revenues, and you check, are you in the black, meaning no negative sign, no red? Then you're in good shape, and you don't assume that it's going to stay in the black. You want to monitor regularly. I look at my budget about every week and make sure things are playing out the way we hope and the way we had planned, and it never does. There's always some changes, some things that happen during the year. You got to make adjustments, but you have to monitor to make sure things are playing out the way you expect. And if there's some surprises, then you deal with them right away. So if you do that calculation and you're in the red, or you see some a minus sign or brackets, so what do? You don't want to bury your hand in the sand. You don't want to hide from that. And I've been in scenarios, I've been in a district where that happened. The lead administrator just basically looked the other way and really hoped the problem would go away the next year. And the next year it didn't make any changes. And we had a pretty significant deficit 3 years in. And so we had to deal with it at that time when it was a lot more difficult to deal with. So a better strategy: review your expenditures. What are the funds what are the things you're buying and paying for? What are possible reductions you can look at? And those are more advanced topics, but definitely you'll have priorities in those reductions that you'd want to look at. And look for ways to increase revenues rapidly. Something that a lot of us leveraged or used back in the last recession with CTE fees and even ESL and ASE fees. Some of us with the authority that was granted to charge fees for those programs, we started charging fees in order to increase our revenue so we wouldn't have to make reductions. Because it's either one or the other. When you're in a deficit, you either got to increase the money that's coming in, or you got to decrease your spending. So what if the district office takes care of my budget? So if you're relying on them, is that effective budgeting? Is that effective monitoring of your budget when somebody else is doing it? So you trust your district and what they tell you, or do you learn some basic accounting and know for yourself where your funds are and how they're being spent? So accounting 101. So one of the things that you'll hear more about if you're not involved with the budget already, and you start becoming involved with it, you're going to hear about account codes, and specifically our SACS codes, standardized accounting code structures. I'm not going to go into detail, except for there's 3 codes that will be often mentioned, and that's going to be the fund source. So the accounting code that represents the fund, and then a resource code, and then we have objects. So I'm going to talk about those 3. And that's going to be the extent of our basic budgeting. And really, for the most part, most of us operate with those 3 terms. We don't really, for the most part, use the other terms too often. So with these 3, a good understanding of these, you should be in a good position to monitor and manage your budget. So common resource codes. A resource code is something that's assigned to every fund source, maybe a budget bill that allocates some funding like CAPE dollars, that allocates some funding and goes out to districts, and they'll assign a code to it so that so they can track it and see how those funds are being used. And so at the highest state level, they could run a resource a query, if you will, or look to see through all the different accounting reports that are submitted to them what was spent in adult debt apportionment. So back in I'm sorry, what was spent in CAPE dollars. So the adult debt fundings that we get right now, the resource code of 6391, they could search on that resource code and be able to see every single district that spent money, that not only that received funds, but then also what they spent out of that resource code just by that number in itself. Or if you get WIOA funds, you're also receiving three different, or those funds are coming in three different pots with each of them having their own resource code. So again, this is going to be shared with you. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but know that your WIOA funding, there's three different ones that are commonly used. There's another one out there, I think a couple other ones that are part of WIOA that you might be receiving that, and they would obviously have a separate resource code. But these resource codes you can use to potentially filter or sift through your budgets to reduce the number of line items that you see and maybe only see these budgets and these expenditures. Let's see, Carl Perkins has his resource code, funds for CalWorks 6371. So these are all, again, ways to identify the funds that you're receiving and then how they're being spent. And your district should have some mechanism where they're tracking this and assigning these resource codes to those funds. And then we get to object codes. This is where we spend a lot of time around these concepts. And that's basically, it is a code assigned to the type of expenditure that is happening. So in case of salaries, that's called I refer to them as the 1000s, and that's going to be your teacher salaries, administrator salaries, counselor, and they all have separate codes that start with the 1 and can be found in the range of 1000s. And so when you look at a budget report, and if you see 1000s, that's basically talking about the salaries only, not payroll costs, not STIRs or PERS, but just salaries that go out towards certificated personnel. And likewise, your classified are represented in the 2000s. And then all the fringe benefits for certificated and classified, you will see start with the 3 and be in the range of 3000s. And then you move on to your books and supplies. This is where you have most of your discretionary funding. This is where you're going to see purchases for computers, books, pencils, paper, those things of that nature. So both for instructional and for administrative. And then you've got your services. So when you're hiring somebody else to do something, or if you're leasing something like a copier or a building, you'll see that in your 5000s. Those are services that are provided that you don't provide, but somebody else is providing for you or to you. And you've got your capital outlay, your 6000s. Those are going to be your big ticket items, maybe a vehicle, a van, a bus that you're going to purchase to transport students to work sites or to colleges for tours. It could be a large computer purchase. Some of the higher end computer servers could run up past $5,000, and typically the cutoff is once you hit an item that's $5,000 or more, it's considered a capital outlay, and it's tracked in a certain way for depreciation and other accounting concepts. And then your 7000s is going to be where you find your indirect costs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But maybe you have a debt on a facility that you're paying down, that would be under 7,000, almost like a miscellaneous category. Maybe I'm not sure if that's the best way to describe it, but again, these are some of these odd, not too frequently used codes that for the most part, your district is operating in and using and tracking. And then your 8000s are your revenues. So all revenues that are received show up in an 8000 resource code, or I'm sorry, object code. So in your budget, probably 75, 85%, if not more, is going to be represented in the 1000, 2000, 3000. So your staffing is the bulk of your costs for the most part. And your 4,000s, 5,000s are going to be a much smaller pot, and they are the easiest to adjust. You can always stop a purchase pretty easily. Just stop a computer order, or even paper. You can try to get by without paper, especially now in this new online environment we're in. You might reduce your costs and cut back on other instructional materials or books. Those are decisions that you would make locally and are fairly easy. When you start having to when you run out of the 4,000s, 5,000s, you can't cut anymore, then you're making the tough decisions. You're going to have to tap into those salary costs. And those are the difficult ones, typically involving unions and your district office, a lot of different procedures involved, and before you can even try to reduce costs there. So just wanted to make you aware that you can do so much. You can handle some cuts with the 4,000s, 5,000s, but at a certain point, you might have to tap into these other costs, your salaries. Fortunately for us, I don't think many of us will be in that situation. I could be wrong, but with flat funding, we should be able to maintain our staffing, and then maybe deal with any extra costs through the 4s and 5,000s by reprioritizing some of our expenditures. And that link below was a link to the manual that you get all the details on how the account codes work and how to label a certain expenditure based on a object code. So again, basic concept, current budget, the total amount you anticipate spending. Your budget's adjustable. Your district will often ask you to readjust your budget, or we'll do it for you, whatever the case may be, based on your expenditures may be projecting too high or too low, and you've got to move some funds around. Typically, that's done before, I believe it's in November, and then again, I think it's March or April. So you have your first interim report, second interim report, and then at the end of the year, you go back and readjust everything to make what we call a clean budget, so you don't see any negatives or very few negatives in the budget's line items. And let's see here. So some things that can change your budget, obviously some operational plans being impacted by unanticipated events like a virus outbreak, or stay home policies, or other things that you might have a plumbing issue that's very costly to repair and have to shift some monies around to be able to pay for the repairs. Or your revenue projections are lower than you anticipated. For example, in fees, if your fees are coming in lower, you might have to adjust again some of your expenditures. And then your expenditures, or your actual expenditures, I refer to them. So those are things that you've already purchased, you received, you've confirmed you received them. So if you paid for a teacher and they've already submitted their time card and they've been paid for that time, typically the prior month, then that's an actual expenditure. If you received a computer, once it's in your possession, and the bill has been paid, then we consider that an actual expenditure, as opposed to an encumbrance. And so in order to not forget about some orders, because sometimes you might order something and forget that it was ordered for some reason, it got delayed, and you're spending dollars, you continue to spend dollars throughout the year. These encumbrances are made so that you can keep a track record of all the things you've ordered, even though you haven't received them. So these are estimated costs. Typically, you get a quote from a vendor. I know in our district, we have a purchasing department that makes every effort to try to find a better quote, lower price. And so at the end of any purchase, they'll go back and readjust the actual cost. They'll readjust the encumbrance to match the actual cost they end up paying. So encumbrances are important because they help you, again, remember what you've already committed to buying and paying for. And then your balance. So what's left? What haven't you spent? And you take a simple budget. Let's say you have a $500,000 budget, and you've spent, or your expenditures are coming in at $450,000. Those are things you've already paid for. And then you have these encumbrances of $35,000, maybe a computer order that hasn't been delivered yet. You subtract the two from the budget, and you're left with a balance of $15,000 at that point. Now, this $15,000 could go up if the computer costs end up to being lower than the $35,000. Typically, they won't be higher, or else that's highly unusual if a quote actually comes out to be higher than what they originally gave you as a quote. but typically you're going to see a little bit a drop in the expenditures when they turn into actuals. And here's a line item example of a budget, and you'll see the various account codes. This is from one of my budgets from a few years ago, and here's we use this concept called a pseudocode. So we take that huge SAC code, reduce it into this smaller, even still lengthy. I don't remember all these codes. I always pay attention to these 1000s. And so you see hourly teachers are assigned an object code of 1110. Substitute teachers are tracked under the object code 1141. You could look down here to books and reference instruction. I'm sorry, go back. Books and instructional materials under 4301. Conferences, where our district tracks it under 5210, which is, again, these are titles that are assigned by SACS, the SACS accounting manual that typically most districts will use. So again, that's just an example. Yours might look different. One of the things I highly recommend is that you be able to sort by what type of object code, which object code you're looking at, sort by maybe your most expensive, your biggest budget. So you want to be able to sort these so you can have different perspective, different views of the budgets to help you make decisions going forward. I typically, for me, I always export it to Excel and then do my filters and different views using some of the advanced Excel features. So types of revenue, don't want to forget about revenues. You want to make sure you're tracking your revenues. So we've got our CAPE dollars. You might be in a consortium that has direct funding, or with the that has a direct fiscal agent model. And so either way, you want to make sure you're aware of what you're supposed to get and that those dollars are actually coming in, showing up in your budget. We got Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, WIOA. LCFF is a fund source that's out there. Every district gets K-12. It actually is an ed code that they can spend money on your programs, like maybe a parent ed program, a Mommy and Me program that they really feel is valuable, and they can allocate some funds out of LCFF to your program for you to manage that. Credit recovery is another popular one where they can take funds. Maybe you used to do the credit recovery in the past, and you've continued to do so because you're just a more flexible, less expensive option to do credit recovery for their high school kids. And so they might fund that credit recovery through their LCFF funds. Reminding us, or it's a reminder that you can't use your CAPE dollars for high school kids unless they're 18 or over. So that's when an LCFF expenditure becomes appropriate to help cover the cost for kids that aren't ready for adult ed, not enrolled in adult ed. And some other fund sources you might be receiving: CalWorks, CalPerkins, fees, Pell Grants, other grants. There's a lot of opportunities out there. If you're not receiving some of these, I would encourage you to look into them. Some of them are a little more difficult to tap into. Some of them require you be in a consortium, if you will, another consortium. I know Carl Perkins has a funding threshold, and if no member within the county or region that's being served by Carl Perkins, I believe you have to have more than $50,000 that are allocated that you qualify for, and if you don't, then you got to join a consortium so you can get a small share, typically less than the 50,000. But definitely those are funds that are out there. And then fees, that's a whole nother area that pretty much, I think, in many ways requires a different set of tools to be able to manage a program that includes fees. I'd call it the more entrepreneurial skills, more business skills on how to market a program, advertise it, figure out costs for a teacher, and making sure that you're whatever that you're going to offer under a fee-based model, that you're covering your costs and having a little bit extra so you can help subsidize or help pay for some of the admin costs that you also are going to incur. And Pell Grants, there's a few of us fortunate enough to be offering Pell Grants, which has been very, very helpful to maintain their CTE programs and grow them. And so that's also an option out there. And I get grant opportunity emails all the time. A lot of them really, I don't look at them other than to see that I don't qualify. That's the first thing I look to see. Do I qualify or can I qualify? But there's still a lot of grants out there, a lot of work, but definitely worth investigating. And then we get to this concept of restricted and unrestricted funds. All dollars to some extent or another have a restriction on them. So when you're dealing with public dollars, they can be considered restrictive. So you can't just take those public dollars and purchase a new car for yourself just because you feel you deserve it and you've been working for the district and the state a long time. So obviously those are a silly example, but the idea is all funds that come from the state have restrictions on them that we have to make sure we're aware of. LCF dollars are considered general funds. Those are most flexible in nature, that have the least restrictions, but again, they have restrictions still. And so your district monitors that and makes sure that they're spending their dollars in accordance with whatever laws are in place at the time. Obviously, when we get into financial constraints, some of those restrictions become become waived. And so every year, every year certain laws change and the restrictions will change, but definitely during times of crisis, as find ourselves in now, some of those restrictions are being lifted so that districts can have the flexibility to be able to mitigate any costs and run their programs without having to take a loan or having to get assistance. I'll just say assistance from the state. That's the last thing any district wants to do. When you get to grants, the state grants, typically they'll have more restrictions, and then we had the federal grants having more restrictions yet, and then private grants tend to be the most restrictive. And what I mean by restrictive, typically they have a specific purpose. The more when you get to state, federal, and then private, as you go down that list, those grants or fund sources typically will come with if you do these things, we will give you these funds. And so, it's just part of what someone who's funding those sources, whether it's the federal government, the state, or private entity, they want to see those dollars spent in a certain way. And so they will make sure that those restrictions are clear and that you're abiding by them. And obviously, if you spend the monies in a way that they did not approve, they did not intend for those funds to be spent, then you risk the loss of those funds and potentially paying back those funds to the fund source. And that typically would happen when you've already paid for something. So if you already purchased a vehicle, for example, for your school, and that was not allowed from through the grant source, you might be stuck with the vehicle, but you have to pay back the funding source agency. And so you want to make sure you know what the rules are when you're spending your dollars that are allocated to you. And sometimes your district won't know. It falls on the administrator, the local administrator, to make sure they understand those rules, because the districts are managing so many different fund sources. They know the big ones. They might not know some of the more specific ones that adult ed folks are dealing with. So make sure you know what those restrictions are going into it when you start spending dollars from any fund source. And there's still some ed code out there that we're trying to clarify with the state that basically says if a district misuses adult ed funds, that they have to pay it back at double the rate. That for some of us have been around, they remember that was definitely a clear and realistic, if you will, applicable ed code back before flexibility hit. That ed code still exists. No one's tested it yet. I'm not sure if anyone's needed to, but I just point that out in case you're having conversations with your district and they want to use funds, and you're trying to get them to understand that's not an appropriate use of funds. Just, you might mention that this is still out there, not as a threat, but just, again, informing them and helping them make the best decisions when it comes to managing the overall district budgets that include the adult ed funds. And so this is always something that districts want to be made aware of, so that they don't make a misstep and then end up we'll say causing a backstep in terms of how they're trying to manage cuts. They don't definitely want to lose money in any maneuvers that they might be implementing, any strategies they might be implementing. So where are we now? So we have our CAPE dollars that are restricted apportionment, and that's, we keep trying to get we every once in a while ask the state to reiterate, to remind folks, district folks, college folks, anyone receiving CAPE dollars, that those are restricted funds. Those are governed by the local consortium. So if you're involved in your consortium, you've had some say in a 3-year plan. and then also an annual plan that comes for the 3-year plan. But that's basically, those are the restrictions that are set on the funds that have been that we've received under CAPE. So obviously the CAPE Ed Code has its laws about which type of students you're going to serve, age restrictions, indirect rates, has a lot of information or restrictions in that way. But then your local plan is also a set of restrictions that's going to govern how you spend your dollars. Fund 11, again, these are the major, this is a major categorical or category, if you will, one of the SACS accounting code mechanisms that we track big budgets. So Fund 11 is the adult ed budget. So anything related to adult ed typically will end up in Fund 11. And at that point, it becomes restricted as it's stated in Ed Code. You've got your WIOA requirements, the outcomes, your quarterly reporting, both in terms of expenditures and your student performance. And so making sure if you're a WIOA recipient, those are definitely parameters we all have to deal with, especially now considering stay home. Most of our students are learning from home, and we're trying to deliver instruction via Zoom or Canvas or whatever you're using. And trying to get students testing has been, shall I just say, difficult, very, very difficult. And that's probably still an understatement. So again, but that's what the requirements call for. We got to be testing students, and recording that, doing a proctored test has been challenging. You have your local district requirements that are going to be imposed on you, and they can change year to year. And other requirements as they come. So the state always has a prerogative, especially under CAPE. There's some language in there that says they can add requirements to our funding, or in order to receive our funding. So they could add more restrictions on how we report attendance, or how we spend our funds, what outcomes we have to report. Those are all not necessarily mentioned in Ed Code, but the state has a prerogative. And when I say the state, it's the chancellor, the Department of Education, and then the state board of executive director have a say in what those restrictions are going to be. So a relationship, I like this graph just because it helps paint a picture of a concept. If you can imagine all these fund sources, or these pots of money, these bags of money that we have out there, you've got state facilities funds. A district has their federal fund, ESSA, special ed fund. And then you see our funding, our CAPE funding, WIOA. They see those as two different funds because that's how they show up in a budget. But in the middle, I've got the big pot of money, for the most part, is going to be their LCFF funding. The goal of the district, the strategy typically is to protect that funding, that LCFF funding, because it's the least restrictive, so it's the most flexible funding. So you've heard of the term cash is king, because cash you can spend anyway. It doesn't have fees associated with it. It's easier to use. Everyone takes cash. So this is like their cash. They're going to protect, and they're going to try to tap into these other fund sources first and spend those down first before they go to LCFF funds. And so this is something that is a natural tendency. So they see the CAPE dollars out there in WIOA, and they often get included in that line of thought. But fortunately, there are restrictions on CAPE and WIOA that they can only be spent a certain way. So they can't really be used for anything other than adult ed. But I'm just pointing this out, that this is a natural kind of a tendency that exists between a district and an adult ed program. And in the same way, our adult ed programs, we have these pots of money. We got our fees and WIOA, CalWorks, and typically most of us will look at our CAPE dollars. It's our biggest fund source, and we want to use those fund sources last, to the extent that we don't violate any promises that we said we're going to do a one-for-one match in terms of expenditures, or that we're required, we're sensitive to supplanting, which I'll talk to in just a minute. But we look at this in the same way, the idea of protecting our most unrestricted funds, and trying to spend down our other dollars that have either timeline restrictions or some other requirements that we just want to meet. We want to meet those requirements or those commitments and spend down those dollars. And again, protecting the bigger pot of money, the most flexible, least restrictive funds. And we get to this concept of supplanting. So supplanting is something I've I've had my own experiences with. I won't go into details, but let's just say it can hurt if you go down this path of supplanting, and no one would intentionally go down this path, but it can happen very easily, especially if you're not made aware, or if you're not aware of the funding restrictions on a certain fund source. So CAPE funding in Ed Code, it's supposed to not be used to replace costs of functions and activities able to be supported by other funds, including apportionment. So this, for us K-12 folks, does not really make sense, because what other fund sources would we be using? Most of those other fund sources are saying the same thing, that we can't use those fund sources unless we to pay for basic adult ed services. And so really that language is more intended for community colleges or charter schools that have another fund source apportionment, whether it's FTES or LCFF. These pots of money are typically their base funding, we call them often. And for them, CAPE dollars are an add-on, and they have to be careful with apportionment. We've got to, and I'm sorry if you hear my dog barking, but someone's at the door. One of the concepts is supplement versus supplant. So any dollars that you received, for example, federal dollars, WIOA dollars, are supposed to supplement your instructional program. So whether it's your ESL program, you try to avoid paying your teachers out of your grants. It's not to say it's not allowed, but you definitely want to make sure you have a program that's sustainable without these other fund sources. And so when an state agency, for example, looks at your fund sources and they see a shift in expenditures, let's say you had a teacher that was paid out of your CAPE dollars, and in this following year you're going to pay them out of WIOA, that would be an obvious supplanting issue that you would want to try to avoid. So moving along, check your guidelines, and definitely the state has guidelines very specific as to how you can spend those dollars. And so I would recommend going to CD's website and looking for the restrictions, and also the adult ed program website, which will give you restrictions and guidelines on how you can spend your dollars and how you can't spend those dollars. And then you've got indirect charges. And this is a question that actually comes up often as far as what can a district charge in indirects. You can think of indirect as a tax that the district can put on your program, most fund sources, not all, but it covers their costs to support your program. So in the adult ed world, we typically don't hire and process teachers where we set up their payroll costs and set up their STIRs and PERS. All that gets set up by the district. That's a cost that a district incurs. And therefore, it's fair to say that they should be entitled to some reimbursement for those costs. And so an indirect rate is what is applied, this concept that pretty much standardizes and sets a rate that the district can charge back those costs. For example, CAPE has a 5% indirect rate, or if they have a district-wide rate that's also calculated separately from CAPE, whichever one of those two is lower, that's the rate that has to be used. And that was something I just want to give a shout out to CCAE that we were able to get implemented, because for a while we were seeing these very very expensive rates, I'll say, upwards of 10%, when some other districts were only charging 4% to their adult ed program. So we standardized that, and hopefully by that protected a lot of funds to make sure those funds get back to students and the services that we're providing. Community ed is separate from adult ed, your fee-based programs, and those typically would just be the district could charge their regular district rate. WIOA is one of those fund sources that you cannot charge an indirect. Your district can't take a portion of that for their costs. It's just something they have to agree to when they approve the application for that grant. And this is my last slide. I'm glad we have some time for some questions. And this is one of the things that I've always come back to when I make budgeting decisions, and recognizing that we're given dollars, we're given these dollars with a trust that we're going to be educating our students, helping students get their high school diploma or equivalency, get trained for a job, learn basic English, and for their purpose of making sure they're prepared for the world that we're in. And so in the last recession, for those of us that remember, there was a significant reduction in our funding, and along with that, there was also a significant reduction in our workforce. And so if you think about the population we serve and you compare that to the workforce that was reduced, 4 to 5 jobs that were destroyed were held by workers with a high school diploma or less. And that really is our population that we have been so diligently and working effortlessly to try to get them out of that educational poverty level, if you will, the illiteracy level. And for me, it's always been about recognizing that when the next downturn happens, and here we are, that we want to make sure our students are prepared. And so how do we spend our dollars to make sure that they are prepared for that they're not at risk of losing their job just because they don't have a high school diploma or they haven't taken any college classes? It really falls on us to try to make sure that educational level for the student is in a place where they can withstand a recession or cuts to the workforce, because really they're the least likely to be able to withstand or deal with a layoff. And so when we make funding decisions, we prioritize our expenditures and the services we provide. I just want to remind folks that in the end, it does impact our students and the families that they're associated with, that they're supporting. And so just a reminder that what we do matters. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Adriana, Adriana Victoria have been tracking the questions, and we have time for some questions. I hope they'll be able to answer quickly.
That was a lot of information. Thank you very, very much,
Sorry
Steve.
to go so fast.
No,
Light speed.
It was great. Light speed is good. We had a couple of questions, a couple of comments. I know Victoria was tracking and doing some things in the chat as well. But one of the questions early on that I saw, and I looked back for it to find out who it was from, and I lost it. But at the very, very beginning, you mentioned flexibility a bit. And the question was, what's stopping schools, districts from doing this again? And I know this is something that recently we've been talking about in our legislative groups. And so maybe you want to mention a little bit of conversation.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest fear. Those of us that have been through it, those of us that have heard of this, of the flexibility idea or the allowance of flexibility back in the last recession, and how detrimental it was to our adult ed programs. And so going into this recession, that was one of the first things that we were communicating with our Department of Finance and trying to get a grasp of what's going to happen. Are we going to get flexibility? And as the budget first came out from the governor, the May revise, again, the May revise is the second iteration of the governor's proposal. Back in January, there was actually a significant increase to K-12 and adult ed funding. We were trying to get more funding, but we were looking at a COLA. Then we get to May revise, and you see these really significant cuts to K-12 programs and adult ed programs. But one of the things that we wanted to make sure was very clear was that flexibility, whether it was coming back or not. And in direct conversation with the Department of Finance, they said that was not the intent of the Department of Finance. And then in other conversations with our legislative folks that are in the budgeting committees, that was also their sentiment, that flexibility would not be part of this budget. And here we are with a signed budget, and flexibility is not an option for a district to use adult ed funds for other purposes. Now, what's to keep? So if you're that administrator, assistant principal, you might have a director that's in charge of multiple programs, and you're seeing things happening where the district, it looks like adult ed funds are being used for services outside of not just your adult ed program, but outside the plan that was approved by the consortium. You're in a tricky situation, and that's where I would, if you don't feel comfortable about saying anything, you definitely reach out to CCAE or CAEAA. We can help try to navigate that, and I would definitely reach out if you're comfortable with it. Or again, we can reach out to your consultant, your CD consultant, or to the CAPE office and let them know what's going on. I know that this has been already attempted a couple times, and CAPE office and the CD office have been very quick to respond to those local districts and remind them of the ed code that's in place that does not allow them to use funds in that way. Remind them the consequences of what would happen if they choose to do so. And in every case that I'm aware of, that effort or that strategy, if you will, and we'll just say they didn't know, the district didn't know that they were, now that they knew what was happening and they knew the guidelines, they backed off and changed their plans. And so, again, it's a difficult conversation, but definitely there's folks out there that will help, and you don't have to just take that on by yourself.
Right, and I apologize. I know it wasn't really a budgeting question, but
No, definitely, yeah.
it is on the minds of several people. Victoria, I think that you picked up on a couple of questions there about the 10 program areas.
Yes, Steve, Elsa from Pittsburgh Adult would like to ask, and if you could expand a little more. We have some new administrators, but about the 10 adult ed programs you mentioned, she's asking.
Yes. So back before the last recession, 08, 09, we operated and delivered services under 10 program areas through the adult ed apportionment. And I forget the exact, I think it was just called the Adult Ed Fund. And that was back in the day when attendance was being tracked and we would get reimbursed for by attendance hours or based on attendance hours. And then flexibility hit, the recession hit, and all that went out the window. And basically districts were given a pot of money for adult ed, and they could choose to use it for adult ed or they could choose to use it for something else. And those program areas still existed. They were still areas we could deliver services from. And many of us reduced our program areas depending on what the priority was for the district you were in. And so when the adult ed funds came into existence, the districts basically, that adult ed pot of money that existed prior to CAPE dollars basically became absorbed into the local control funding formula. So that became part of their funding that they got for kids and weren't mandated to use that money for adult ed programs. What they received in replacement was the CAPE dollars, and those CAPE dollars were restricted to the 7, I think it is a 7.6 that we have now, and did not include home economics, parent ed in a different flavor of the way we use it now, that if we're running it under CAPE, or older adult programming, and health and safety. Those are the 4 main areas where we saw a shift away from those. Now, the district still had funds, still has the funds. The LCFF has the old, I always remind folks that the district still have the old adult ed money incorporated in the LCFF, and they have the opportunity, they have the ability to still spend dollars in those areas. I've not heard, other than for parent ed, I've not heard a district offer to spend LCFF dollars for home economics or older adults. It's just not something that falls into their priorities. It could be happening. I just haven't heard of it. But those are some areas that exist in the past that are still in the books. They're still in ed code that a district could offer those services. It's just that the funds to offer those program areas are now shifted from adult ed funds to your local control funding formula that districts use.
Thank you, Steve. That helps tremendously because that does go back a ways. Many of us remember that. And just to fast forward, we do have in the original ABG legislation one where we can have older adults and adults supporting K-12 children. So that might be some uncharted territory also in terms of programming that
Yes.
can be, this funding on the LCFF side now could be used for.
Yes, definitely.
Etc. So just a thought.
Right. I have another question, and I think it was typed into the chat in 2 different parts. And the question initially, I think, was, how do the funds become recategorized to use in another fund? And I think the clarification on that was, for example, if you don't have a lot of paper use, or you have fewer insurance costs than you initially had budgeted for, workers' comp, those kinds of things. How do you go about moving money around, Steve?
That's another great question. The example given sometimes in the workers' comp, your payroll, salary costs, we call them. So you have your unemployment. You might put your STRS. The STRS would be part of that. All those funds are based on pretty much projections on your salary, based on your salary costs. So if you expect to be spending $1 million in salary for teachers, typically it's around 18, 19% in payroll costs that the district will budget. So they know they have to pay those payroll costs, and they're going to estimate what those costs are. In those situations, they would be hesitant, I would imagine, a district office to if you think it's going to be less, or if you let a teacher, maybe they only had them for the half a year and not the full year, so you're going to see some savings in payroll costs and salaries. Oftentimes districts won't let you touch those accounts. And so that's where a very good relationship, some trust building with your district as far as your ability to manage a budget comes into play, and making sure that if you're saying, look, I'm going to have these funds left over and I'd like to move them, and basically it's called a budget transfer. I would like to reduce my teacher salary costs in the 1,000s and the 3,000s by $100,000, whatever it's going to be. And I want to increase my 4,000s in supplies by $100,000. And so that's something an accounting person, either at the district office, or if you're lucky enough to have one of your own, that's a process that they can begin. And as long as it's approved by the district, it's a pretty routine process. It's done all the time. I mean, hundreds of times probably in a day that they're doing budget transfers because things do never really come out exactly the way we anticipated them in terms of expenditures and revenues.
Great, thank you. And Bronca,
Yeah,
go ahead.
the last question from Bronca. Do
There you
most schools, Bronca is asking of the panelists, and I think also just for everyone, do most schools have, I'm sorry, I lost it here, but the idea is 4 times a year or multiple times a year where adjustments are made, and the answer would be yes, essentially. But for moving funds between categories, the 1,000s and 7,000s, it's your budget revisions, it's a regular schedule, and typically fiscal services departments publish it internally for staff, for management to know that it's coming up and to prepare for it. It's an opportunity to adjust budgets to a more actual picture than what had been projected initially. So thank you for that question, Bronca.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other last minute questions? We're getting down to the wire on time. And I think, Adriana, we've answered all the questions. Is that right? That you've
Pretty much. We had a couple of great suggestions from Rocky that you mentioned, Victoria.
Yes.
You reiterated. Do you want to go through those, and then I'll wrap it up?
Well, one of them I put in the chat box says a good way to manage your budget when you have your budget submitted is and make sure you spend down your funding as you anticipate, is to have your expenditures equal about 10% per month, so that you don't end up at the end of the year with, let's say, too much funding in your which should be first in pots like WIOA funding, and then have to do a lot of shifting or budget transfers, which will make your fiscal services department crazy. So you do want to make sure that you're monitoring on a regular basis, not just the quarterly times, but that's a good time to do the adjustments. I think that was
That's a great advice. I think one of the things, and that's kind of speaks to the relationship that is important to have with your district fiscal folks. When you make changes, that means more work for the district folks, and that they have plenty of work that they're dealing with too. So making sure you're monitoring your budget and having good estimates for your year, which seems almost like, well, how do you estimate for a whole year of expenditures, especially if you have a multi-year budget? Well, you look at prior years, how was this funding spent in past years, and try to get this baseline developed of an annual budget, and then you make your tweaks, if you will, going there. But when you start going out of budget, or let's say you start going into the red in certain budget line items, that's when people start noticing your district office, and that really kind of hampers your relationship or the trust you build with them. So you want to make sure you're on top of it. It does happen all the time, but you want to try to minimize it. And so again, having that trust from your district really goes a long way so that you can provide the services that really your adults need. And oftentimes that the district's offices don't understand. They don't understand our adult population and how we have to deliver services. And so you want to build that trust. You want to manage your budgets well, so that they can just kind of hand it off to you and just do some minor remote monitoring. And yeah, and then one of the other things that's definitely, I'll give you some other free advice as far as purchase orders. This is one thing that I keep getting, and depending on who your purchasing person is, but they want you to plan ahead of time, order your stuff ahead of time. You do not want to be submitting purchase orders in every month saying that these are ASAP, I need them right away. Plan your purchases, and it kind of goes to Rocky's point of plan your purchases ahead of time, get them in, and then so that there's a good enough time for purchasing and the whole budgeting process to catch up with your expenditures and those orders that they're making.
Great.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I think we're to the good. It's 1 o'clock, and can I just do a shout out for the legislative work you have all done? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Some of our participants actually had to drop off for appointments with their legislators. It's really great to hear and know that you are continuing to engage with your legislators, which is a major talking point in Dawn's recap of the budget agreement, which was just e-blasted to all members. I hope you have seen it. If not, please look in your email and check the website for the up-to-date information. So thank you, Steve. Thank you for the great presentation, basic budgeting. We will be glad to share, and I think additional questions can go directly to Steve as well. And Adriana, any last words from you? And thank you, Adriana, for your help and support.
Absolutely. So upon exiting today's webinar, there's a little note in the chat. You'll be redirected to a mini poll. And we'd really, really appreciate your feedback, because that helps us to see what other items need to happen for you. So appreciate your feedback. And I just really like to thank Steve and Victoria and David, all of you, Steve for your information, Victoria for your support with the chat, and David for your support with the technical assistance. Thank you, everybody, but thank you mostly to our participants. So we all look forward to seeing you and working with you in the upcoming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Mm-hmm.